My name is Karen Biza-Turlo, and I'm on the developer relations team here at PayPal. I'm really excited about today's episode because we're diving into a question that might just change how you think about shopping. What if shopping wasn't something you did, but something that was done for you, exactly how you wanted it? Pretty wild, right? Well, today we're talking about agentic commerce, how smart tech is transforming the way we buy things, and how PayPal is right at the center of this shift. Joining me is someone who's in the thick of it, Jonathan Cordeau, a VP here at PayPal focused on enterprise payments growth. Jonathan, welcome. Can you kick things off by telling us a little bit about yourself and what big challenges are you working on over here at PayPal?
Hey, Karen, thanks for having me. So I work really at the intersection of our products, our go-to-market teams, and our sellers. This really puts me at the center of working with some of the world's largest merchants and how they can grow their businesses, leveraging our products and our partnership. And as you can imagine, a lot of what that has looked like lately has been this little thing called agentic commerce. So I've really had a front seat into how a lot of the world's largest brands and LLMs have been working on this new challenge and diving into the opportunity.
Awesome. So I know a lot of your work is helping, teams internally and audiences externally understand and adapt to agentic commerce. So why don't we start a little bit by kind of defining what that means? What exactly is agentic commerce and how does it differentiate between maybe personalization or conversational commerce?
Yeah, so there's this big shift happening, this kind of big paradigm adjustment where historically we've spent a lot of our time over the course of the past decade, let's say, optimizing our websites and our apps for conversion. We've tweaked little pixels, we've moved buttons around, we've really thought about that top of the funnel. And so a lot of what we as consumers experienced and what brands and merchants were working on was how to get those kind of taps and clicks and swipes to drive conversion. In this new world, we're moving away from all of that kind of discovery happening with the human in the loop, navigating through websites and user interfaces. And we're moving towards a much more intent-driven action. And so a lot of what we're working on today, both internally and merchants around the world, is how do we make sure that we're going to show up where our customers want to actually make purchases? And what does that look like if it's no longer inside of my app or on my website? What does it look like if it's actually done by an agent?
Yeah, so you're talking about a little bit about agents, so we'll dig into that further, especially since this is on the developer channel. But why are you seeing that this is the next big shift in digital commerce?
So we as consumers, it's wonderful that we have so much choice, but the reality is that there's a little bit of a analysis paralysis, if you will, that can happen. And so with the new connectivity that we have, driven by all of the data that LLMs have and the efficiency at which they can really help us manage the discovery portion of the kind of commerce lifecycle, it really allows us to, as developers, take an entirely new kind of thought process to the experiences that we can deliver to our end customers. And ultimately, that looks like getting much, much faster at putting a product, in the case of commerce, in front of a user for them to potentially purchase. And whether that's a kind of human assist or human in the loop, where discovery happens and ultimately a consumer goes through and makes those final decisions, or it's a highly intent-driven type of query where you can really offload that work to the agent and it kind of just automatically happens, if you will. And I'm sure we'll get into some examples later. In either case, developers and product people like myself have an entirely new toolkit that we can work from in order to deliver these experiences, not just like we have in the past where there were these minor optimizations, which were all meaningful to increase conversion, ultimately increase sales, but really entirely new ways in which our customers will leverage our products to both discover and purchase.
Yeah, I love that word, auto magical. I feel like that kind of sums things up, the mystery of when you have a really amazing experience. What factors, technological and maybe behavioral, are making agentic commerce possible today?
Yeah, great question. So we can break those down into maybe two because they're pretty kind of seismic on both sides. From a technological standpoint, the developers on this listening to this podcast will know better than I, but we have obviously had major shifts happening as it relates to our ability to process and ultimately leverage data that these LLMs are building on top of, or the agents are leveraging. And so ultimately what you have is an entirely new way that you can build experiences because you have access to data and you have access to processing that historically wasn't there. So I won't go into and shouldn't in my position go into the history of kind of how we got here. The reality is that this work hasn't happened overnight. It's been literally decades of, building and learning to get where we are today. But the reality is kind of the outcome that we have from a development standpoint is an entirely new set of tools. I kind of will keep saying that allows us to really rethink how we can build and the experiences that we can deliver. What that looks like today is the ability to leverage new sets of data, new types of compute, much more kind of refined reasoning, and ultimately that can kind of drive us to think about what types of products can be built now that weren't able to be built, previously, because quite honestly, these tools didn't exist. What's super exciting is that the tools that we have today, as we record this podcast, are the worst version of the tools that we will have. Every day, things are getting better. We just, at the time of this podcast, Grok 4 was just released, and we've seen kind of an entirely net new best, which will likely be bested by another in the near future. So it's an exciting time. From a kind of a consumer standpoint or a personal standpoint, we are getting used to how we purchase things in an entirely new way. And that's not just this kind of idea of agentic. We go back to, if you think about historically, maybe you went and shopped at the stores that were in your town, or maybe you went to the mall, and that was kind of your universe for commerce, if you will. And then we had the web, which obviously opened things up pretty significantly. Then you went global with marketplaces, and all of a sudden you could buy a candle that was hand poured in South America, and that wouldn't have been something that was available to you. As working here from PayPal, we were a big part of that shift, but ultimately it took a lot of innovations all over the place in order to enable that. And we're now in this kind of third kind of iteration of that, which is no longer just more choice that you could basically buy anything, anywhere, anytime across the globe. But that takes a lot of individual work. And so now we have the opportunity to kind of put the onus on the agent to go and do that work for you. And so if you said, I want to buy the best hand-poured candle in the world based on my preferences, you can imagine that could be an entire day's worth of searching and discovery, which could be super fun for you. Or maybe you're just looking for the end result, which is an amazing end product, based on your experiences. And that makes the entirety of the world, if you will, available to us, which is super exciting. But I know we'll get into some of the, the details here of, how we make sure that that's done in a trusted way. And that also drives a lot of inclusion for those around the world that want to participate as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on a lot of important topics that the developers are focused on, is the trust factor. And really what we're trying to do is give consumers choices. And I think, with agents and this whole kind of new wave, that's what we're doing. Like you said, if you want to spend all day researching, you totally can. But if you want to, ask a question and do something really quickly, then you're able to get in there and find what you're looking for. So it's really the discoverability and a couple other things that agentic commerce is really bringing to the table. So you talked
I just want to jump right in. There's something
Sure.
I really just made me think of that's, I think, important as well, as again, going back to us as consumers, because ultimately, we as product people and developers, we need to build experiences that drive utility, right? So ultimately, if we want someone to use these new tools, it needs to drive some kind of an outsized value, an outcome that maybe wouldn't be delivered in another way. So that's the challenge that we have. Something I think is really interesting is about driving, how do we get to utility and ultimately habituation? We as consumers are also getting trained on the idea of curation. If you think about, again, if you were looking for an outfit previously, maybe you kind of walked through a bunch of different sites to figure out what to wear. And now maybe you would lean on an influencer that would have kind of curated styles for you. And so again, just kind of driving the idea of how do we build the future? Part of it is leveraging what do we see that's working today, and leveraging that kind of highly curated approach that we're seeing really emerge from a shopping experience, kind of driven through some of the social channels. You can see how that's like a step change in the right direction in order to enable the type of agentic experiences that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're talking a lot about kind of new shopping experiences, what that looks like. You've talked a little bit about, kind of influencers, checking out what influencers that you follow on social media, what they like, and making decisions that way. I'd love to kind of take a step and let's put this into a real world example. So could you walk us through a real world example of maybe how a shopping agent might assist a customer from start to finish?
Yeah, the beauty of talks like this and all of the fun things that are happening right now from a development standpoint is we get to a little bit kind of look into the future and say, what is it that we would want? And hopefully someone's building it, or maybe we build it ourselves. One of the use cases I love, which is very, very selfish, is, think of the prompt. I want to eat at 7 p.m. every night, and I want it to be based on my preferences, and I want to pay less than $12. And so you can imagine in that fairly simple prompt, there's an incredible kind of array of jobs to be done in order to actually deliver that experience. Now, you could do that today across a multitude of apps. and going through and, scheduling orders in the future and, all of the different components that it would take to do that. But in that prompt, if you broke it down from a jobs to be done standpoint, you can see who's making the purchase, maybe what are their preferences, maybe you're plant-based or maybe you are paleo, something of that nature. You also think about where you're located and the restaurants that are near you. What about restaurants that have specials on certain nights? What about restaurants maybe that are busy and maybe can't get the food to you and by that 7 p.m. window? What about restaurants and the cost associated with them and making sure that your meal is less than $12? And so you can imagine, there's a world where if you kind of squint a little bit, you can see every night food just shows up at your doorstep at 7 p.m. and it meets those parameters. And that is much more attainable when you have, we'll call it an army of agents that go out and are, checking the ratings of websites or of different restaurants, that are checking your preferences and mirroring them against, the top items that from that restaurant and how they meet your food preferences. You think about the way that maybe you would rate the meals that you're getting to further refine, the algorithm, if you will, or the preferences that are hit in order to continue to improve that experience. And then I think what's really exciting, so one, you can see how it's kind of a straight line to how we could see that happen. But I think what's really exciting is how that also then kind of opens up net new opportunities to build upon that experience. So now imagine that that's connected to your calendar and you don't have to worry about not scheduling the meal at 7 p.m. for a night that you already have dinner planned, or maybe you're out of town. And I think we've all experienced, meal delivery kits or something, piling up because you forgot to cancel the order before it was going to show up. And so I think this will really, you can imagine how that will drive a lot of choice and productivity and maybe great discovery of new restaurants you wouldn't have tried. But at the same time, the challenge to us as product people and developers is we have to go build that. And I think that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. It also makes me think about just helping to reduce mental load from the consumer when you're, living busy lives. I even think of parents or folks like have to make a bunch of decisions. So what agentic commerce really does is, you're talking about reducing friction and discoverability, comparison and checkout, but really what it's doing is helping to reduce that mental load of decision making. If you would like that support in your kind of day-to-day shopping experience, you're really letting consumers compare and contrast choices without a lot of effort.
Absolutely.
So let's dig into PayPal's role here in enabling the agentic economy. So let's talk a little bit about what role does PayPal play in powering agentic commerce?
We are experts at commerce. We have amazing relationships with 430 million plus consumers who leverage us daily to make purchases and feel really confident that those items, for example, are going to show up on their doorstep. And we have 30 million plus merchants who use us in order to process those financial transactions and ultimately run their business, lots of different components of that on top of our platform. And that two-sided network, the connection between consumers and merchants, really helps to drive a lot of understanding of what needs to happen for a successful commerce transaction, if you will, to take place. I mentioned before the jobs to be done. These are the jobs to be done that we've been working on for a very long time. And when we think about how these jobs to be done change a little bit in the way that this shift is happening with agentic commerce, we've been taking a step back to say, how can we think about all of the ways in which we can add value across the entire experience? So not just that kind of time of payment, of which we're really good at that, but how can we help with things like identity? So understanding who the actual consumer is that made the purchase. What about who the merchant is and our relationship with merchants and understanding not only the legitimacy of the merchant, but think about things like the quality of that merchant and how quickly they ship items. How often are there returns? How likely is it that there's going to be quality issues related to that merchant that we can maybe help consumers or ultimately LLMs understand? So we're really thinking about the kind of the underlying infrastructure that can drive this connection between the consumer and the merchant and the LLM. And a really big part of that is the connectivity between the merchant and all of their product data and their ability to process those orders and how that can be surfaced inside of an LLM. And so we see us playing a really strategically important role in driving a lot of trust between a merchant who wants to be discoverable inside of an LLM and by an agent, and the consumer who wants to feel really confident that that product that was ultimately, the one that they decide they want to buy is, again, legitimate. It's going to show up on time. They're going to feel really confident that when they commit to the order, it's going to be in inventory. And so that entire kind of jobs to be done framework really helps us to think about all of the different ways that we can bring value and, quite honestly, kind of where we're making those investments, where we have, teams of developers and product managers and our sellers and our go-to-market, folks all working really hard to make sure that we're kind of leading from the front to drive both consumer trust as well as enabling merchants to really participate in this, kind of entirely new economy that's developing on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And you're talking a lot about, you know, all of the infrastructure and the tools that we're building to enable this, to enable consumers. So can you talk a little bit about our agent toolkit and what enables developers to use it?
Yeah. So, shout out to PayPal.ai to validate everything I'm about to say. So that's where our documentation is and where you can access our MCP server, for example. When I think about the benefit of not just all of this kind of new consumer and merchant, these new experiences that are coming, but from a developer standpoint, we also have some new advents that really help us to think about, what I would say abstracting away the complexity of building new tools. So, we were really early to adopt and release the MCP, the Model Context Protocol. And, what that really is a way to abstract away the complexity of connecting to lots and lots of different APIs, ultimately drives a lot of kind of protocol standards to make development a lot easier. This hopefully unlocks a few different things. Ultimately, number one, we're hopefully a lot more efficient. And so we can build things faster, better, with much more kind of clarity of detail, if you will, because we can access the information without having to first understand and abstract or kind of navigate through all of the challenges, right, through that abstraction. Ultimately, what that should let us do is, because we can access more data more quickly in a more kind of natural language way, we can now think about building experiences that we maybe couldn't have previously. So ultimately, can we leverage data to drive personalization at checkout would be a great example. And so ultimately, the overall kind of approach with the PayPal Agentic Toolkit is to give developers a playground to build these new experiences that, some of which we can, think about, like the, meal delivery or food delivery that I mentioned before. But quite honestly, the exciting thing is things that we don't even know are going to come, the playground of going and building a lot of things and seeing what works and seeing what kind of value you can drive to the market. And we're seeing that on a daily basis, literally, of going through and kind of reviewing what's been built and kind of how the tools are being leveraged and how we can continue to invest in more and more use cases. So not just the ability to understand identity, track shipping, but, and drive a payment, for example, but how can we make sure that we're, kind of meeting developers where they are and all of the, quite honestly, the kind of crazy and futuristic ways that they want to build these new experiences.
Yeah, I love it. I think, PayPal's really focusing on, choice and building products for our consumers, but also for developers. So they do have the choice to build how they want to build. We're meeting them where they are. And also too, the tools are being built for both high volume enterprise needs and also can be flexible for smaller and medium-sized business integration needs. And all this backed by PayPal's trusted and secure global payment network. So we're really doing a lot of work to meet developers and consumers where they are and build for the future.
Yeah, Karen, I think you just said a really important point of where we sit again, as a product person, we sit in a really kind of fun intersection between the world's largest merchants and all that we learn from interacting with, sophisticated development and payments teams and use cases and, really being at the forefront of what this future could look like, and quite honestly, what's being built today. But at the same time, we work with, amazing small businesses, from the solopreneur all the way through to, the micro brands. That's where we are really, we're hopeful, but we're really excited about the opportunity to really bring new solutions to the entirety of our customer base, which, in this case is merchants big and small. And what that hopefully does is really drive entirely new outcomes with all of the different tools and experiences and, things that the devs are going to be building and are building out to the market, to consumers, to not just our 430 million consumers, which is nice to have a good kind of understanding of who you're selling to immediately, but how we connect to any consumer across the globe through a bunch of our different tools as well. So this is a way for us to think about, any consumer and any merchant participating in our overall benefits of, kind of our large two-sided network and the relationships we have on both sides of that with both consumers and merchants.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be fun to see what our developers come up with in the community. I guess open invitation if you are working and using our tools. We'd love to hear from you. So open invitation to find me on LinkedIn or find us on paypal.ai and share what you're working on. So let's talk a little bit about challenges and barriers to adoption that you're seeing, because I'm sure there are some challenges standing in the way of agentic commerce adoption. But what are some of the biggest ones that you've seen so far, Jonathan?
Yeah, Karen, I think we all wish that we could kind of sprinkle some AI dust on, what we're working on, and somehow magically it just works. I do think it's pretty exciting that we are able to leverage a lot of the kind of AI development tools themselves to really help us to move more quickly. You think about things like acceptance testing and how we can leverage automation. I think there's hopefully we're all reaping a lot of the benefits of those things. When we think about, this new agentic commerce kind of future, there are definitely a couple of things, more than a couple, but a couple that are, I think, top of mind. There's a lot of kind of known unknowns right now. There are, definitely areas when we think about the experience and those jobs to be done that we want to deliver for consumers. A consumer is going to adopt these new tools because it's going to feel native. It's going to feel familiar. They're going to trust the experience. It's going to be deeply embedded and personalized. But to get there, you have to access a lot of data. And so we want to make sure that that's being done in a really secure way, a way that can not only drive trust with the consumer, but with the brands, and make sure to protect a lot of the integrity of that experience. And how we're going to do that, that's a lot of the work that's happening right now, is kind of really looking at how we can drive that trust across those different layers. There's things like shipping information and taxes are great examples of, in many cases, kind of dynamic information that can't be scraped, for example. And so making sure that, on our end, we're putting a lot of investment into how we are thinking about kind of empowering LLMs to gather that data in a way that's safe and secure. You'd be, kind of missing it or remiss, if you will, if you didn't talk about the fact that there's definitely a need for standardization around regulation here. There's a lot of, in this case, kind of unknown unknowns. Like, we need some ways to kind of govern, making sure that when an agent is making a purchase, that agent actually has the right to use that financial instrument. How has the consumer given consent for that? How is that consent kind of tracked? How do we make sure that, merchants who are participating in this new kind of form of commerce are actually real merchants? One of the benefits of all of this kind of great kind of new AI stuff that we have is that you can build things really fast that look pretty great. One of the challenges is that you can build things pretty fast that look pretty great that may not be legitimate. And so thinking about how, the networks, the issuers, platforms such as ours, the LLMs, how we're going to navigate through this in a way that's going to, again, drive that trust and consumer desire for the benefits that they'll get from that is, I think, a little bit unknown. So, a lot of conversations happening across those different surfaces, a lot of great collaboration across, both competitors and those that are building in the space as well, to really kind of explore what solutions need to be brought to, again, in some cases, challenges that we know that are coming, but maybe aren't super clear yet of what those are going to look like or what the solutions look like as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of work is being done to hold on to that trust. And, so with addressing these things and being aware is one way to address that. And so how is PayPal working to reduce friction and lower the barrier to entry for participants in the ecosystem?
So we talked about the MCP, server as one. Ultimately, because of our relationships with merchants and with LLMs, we sit at a really unique place to, as I mentioned before, really bring a lot of these innovations to the market in a way that's going to serve both large and small merchants. Another thing that we're really focused on is education. I'm really fortunate to be in conversations on a daily basis with merchants and get to hear kind of the spectrum of how they're thinking about, what this means for their business. And you kind of go through the entire, I'm sure there's some kind of like psychological framework here, but the entirety of everything from, fear and worry and doom and gloom all the way through to a tremendous amount of excitement. I would say this is a great plug for, getting involved now to learn and to evolve and to iterate. This is definitely not the time to sit back and maybe see things how things evolve, not only because they're evolving so quickly, but because I think a lot of the learnings that we're gathering today will really help us build the right products in the future. And whether that's the right product from a developer standpoint, or if it's the right product from how a merchant thinks about presenting the data related to the product, how they're going to think about positioning, how they're going to think about the benefits that they can drive beyond just the purchase of the item itself, but things like loyalty. And so when we are in these conversations, I think maybe partially part of our conversations are maybe a little bit of therapy sessions, but also the opportunity, I think, hopefully to bring a lot of not only our perspective and where we think we fit really well to drive a lot of innovation and partnership with merchants, but also the ability to kind of help them navigate through, like, what does this mean for me? What does it mean when I've spent the last 10 years trying to optimize SEO to get people to my website? What if they don't go to my website anymore? What does that mean for how I need to be thinking about building, my brand and my, kind of overall approach for the future? And so it's a super fun time. It's obviously an exciting time to be in this space in particular. But I think, seeing how we as a company and the positioning that we have really can help to, kind of lead a lot of these conversations and hopefully bring a set of solutions to the market that ultimately allow for all of the players to feel like they're, that it's inclusive, that it's going to be beneficial, that it's going to be in a safe and trusted way. These are all of, I think, kind of the key components of where we're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a nice plug for PayPal.ai, because that's really, the focus is everything on that website is there to educate developers and merchants as well too, of what the future holds and how to work, kind of best practices with working with the tools that are available now, and also to the little education of what this means for the future and how we can kind of expand and build upon the tools that we already have. So I welcome everyone. Check out PayPal.ai.
What's super exciting about this, to interject, if you will, is that PayPal.ai is evolving on a daily basis, and obviously we're plugging it. You're listening to a PayPal podcast, but hopefully what I'm doing, is giving a nice kind of overview of where we're at in the space, which will change tomorrow. But you can also almost like take a look back in time and see, a few months ago we had our PayPal Dev Days here on campus in San Jose, and there was a tremendous amount of recordings and content that was developed and delivered for that conference. Where you really can deep dive into the details from a developer standpoint, much more than you're going to get from me. But you also can probably see, even just a few months ago, where we were and where we are now and the evolution of that as well. So, definitely a plug for the content there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So how should merchants and developers, for that matter, think about their role in this agent-driven shopping experience?
So for merchants, this is not like a bystander moment. You could imagine that a merchant could, in a way, kind of sit back and say, well, I have great products and they'll be discoverable somehow, and I will just reap the rewards of people going through and ultimately finding my products through some new agentic way. That could happen. But I think this is really a time to understand the unique position that you play in the overall marketplace, how you are competitive, what are the unique things about your brand that make people choose to purchase, you versus your competitor. How do you think about loyalty? I had a conversation last week with a pretty large brand that was really thinking about literally their tagline and how that tagline may not be super relevant in the future. And so this is definitely a time to be very proactive and ask yourself these questions. From a developer standpoint, to some extent, those are all problem statements that developers could maybe build things and solutions to solve some of those issues. So if you think about everything from, what does search engine optimization historical, what does that look like now? How do we think about things like rewards and loyalty? How do we think about all of the different ways in which a brand is exposing their features and benefits out to the market in general, and certainly, into the LLMs for discovery? I'll go back to, the jobs to be done framework. I think one of the best things that can be done is this idea of outcome-driven innovation. How do you take a step back and say, where is the market lacking in something they really want that isn't there? And, a little bit of that is the known unknown that I mentioned before. But I think this is, what we're going to see, I think, is a tremendous amount of super smart, developers, product people, identify those, kind of real areas of opportunity where that innovation really lies, with the shift in, behavior that we're going to see, both in how merchants participate in this economy, but also how, consumers as well. And so really spending time to think about what is changing, how are the jobs to be done maybe different or maybe unaddressed, and how can I think about, kind of focusing what I'm building around delivering those new outcomes in a way that's going to drive value.
Absolutely. I think what you're speaking to is it's opening up a lot of new opportunities, not only to developers, but also merchants. So, if you're thinking about creativity and choice, really kind of a whole new level of being able to open those two things up.
I tend to be a pretty optimistic person. And so I agree that, there's definitely a little bit of kind of maybe fear, uncertainty, and doubt right now, what's going on. But I think the real opportunity here is to recognize that there's a whole kind of new world coming and we get to participate in it and we get to build it. And rather than focusing on, in some cases, the unknowns or the fear, I get to capture that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing a lot too with the developer community, a lot of kind of learning out in the open. And I think that's really kind of an amazing spirit and kind of captures the excitement and change is getting to see what others are doing and, seeing presentation, meetups, conferences. Just it's a really nice space to be in. And if you're excited about building, there's just like wealth of knowledge and information you can find online to enable you. So what safeguards is PayPal putting in place around data privacy and ethical use of AI in commerce?
So we sit on a tremendous amount of data, as I mentioned before. It's the foundation of trust that we have with the market in general. We're fortunate that there have been years and years of investment in this space, and it's incredibly important to us, both the trust that we've built with consumers. As you can imagine, consumers need to feel really confident to store their most sensitive data with us, whether it's their physical location or it's their, instruments, but also with merchants that, we, handle a lot of their money and making sure they feel really confident that we're going to, be good stewards of that. At the same time, because we've been around for a while and been doing this for a while, we have over 800 AI and ML fraud related models that ultimately will make sure that when someone, goes to make a purchase, that it's a legitimate purchase, both on the consumer and the merchant side. So, we're really investing in how we can leverage years and years and years of work that's been done and deployed across these new surfaces to ensure that we ultimately protect all this, really sensitive data. When we think about personalization, we want to make sure that we are driving a highly personalized experience and helping agents and LLMs to, deliver experiences that are going to be really highly converting. At the same time, we want to protect the sensitive data that could be leveraged in order to deliver that personalized experience. So, we're thinking a lot about how we use things like secure compute and clean rooms and, the cutting edge of tokenization in order to share data in a way that can drive an outcome, but ultimately protects the underlying instrument. Doing that for many, many years. If you think about payment tokenization, ultimately that's really just storing and sharing a really sensitive piece of data. And we can do that across the entirety of our system. At the same time, it's kind of interesting to hear from the LLMs kind of how they're thinking about this as well. It is top of mind, unsurprisingly. And there's also not just from an ethical standpoint of how do we protect the sensitive data and the preferences and kind of the overall user identity, but also how do we do that in a way that not only drives high trust and conversion, but ultimately maybe also drives an experience that has lineage. So if I bought an item in a certain size, when I go to search in the future, does that also kind of drive a personalized experience? But that also is really kind of built on top of this. What I'm hearing is the idea that the LLMs want to really remain neutral. So they're thinking a lot about how do I not be influenced, by ads? How do I not be influenced by any kind of component and really drive a deeply personalized but neutral discovery experience that ultimately will land to the best item possible, independent of, we'll call it kind of external factors like ads. And so, we'll see how that shapes up, but it is definitely part of the overall conversation.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us today and for all of you on this journey into agentic commerce. The idea that shopping isn't just something that you do, but something that's done for you exactly how you want it. We've learned that it's not just a concept anymore. It's an emerging reality. PayPal's APIs are already powering millions of secure commerce experiences across over 200 markets worldwide, built for scale both for large enterprises and small businesses. If you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to head over to paypal.ai. There's a plethora of amazing resources for developers, and also if you're a merchant, small business owner, I encourage you to check out the site and dig in and learn more about the tools and what we're doing over at PayPal. Until next time, keep reimagining the way you shop. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.